Hi, Ashley, and welcome to the Natural Birth Podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share my positive birth story with everybody. I'm very honored and privileged to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you. So, with no further ado, please take us back to the first time you became pregnant because you've had two babas, and we're gonna focus on your second. That was the natural, empowering birth story. But obviously, the first one also taught you so much and took you to where you then ended up with your second and the person that you are today, sharing your stories here. So please share with us becoming pregnant and deciding to go with an OB for your first.
Yeah, so my first pregnancy, it took us a couple months. I was very fortunate for that. We live in a smaller area where having a midwife is not super common. In this area, we don't really have midwives that do hospital births. And at the time, I guess looking back, I after the fact realized, oh, there actually is a midwife in this particular hospital. And I was like, I wish I would have known that. But either way, midwives in hospitals still are guided by all those policies. So it probably wouldn't have been something that would have made that much of a difference, honestly. But I searched out a midwife, but really my only options here in this area were a home birth midwife or an OB in a hospital. And my husband, who's, kind of just like, I'm not really sure that we really want a home birth for our first. And I'm like, "Oh, okay, but this is the type of, hospital birth that I want. This is, I don't want an epidural. I don't want medication. I want to be left alone. Like I did all my research on, as much of a natural minded pregnancy and birth that you could have. And still ultimately we went with an OB because that's what we both kind of agreed upon, like it's our first, the hospital is about 20-minute drive still, like let's just go with that. And I felt like, okay, I can do this. I can do my research and feel confident in my decisions. And I even took the Positive Birth Company virtual course and really learned about, you know, purpose of contractions and what your body's really doing and ways you can have a really positive hospital birth.
Mm.
Um, but even with all of that research and me feeling like I really knew what to expect and being, up to date on hospital policies and all the things that was going to be offered
Yeah.
in birth at a hospital, I I still struggled there.
Yeah.
I also had my first in 2020, so it was
Mm.
about my second trimester when everything shut down and, you know, even having my partner in the room was up in the air. Thankfully, I was in a state that, and it was summertime, so things were like slowing down.
Mm.
I was in a state that was a little bit more lenient with things. So my husband was there for our hospital birth. Um, but it was very challenging because as soon as I get in the hospital, my contractions completely slowed down. One thing that set me off that I attribute to kind of how things progressed was the fact that when I got into triage, they told me who my OB was, and I said, that's not my OB. So out of the three doctors in the office, not one of those names was there and mentioned, and I was not told that that was going to be the case. And even if I was told that at some very, very early on appointment, I was never reminded that leading up
Mm.
to, my later appointments or the 40-week appointment or anything. So that like really just threw me, and I could just feel like my heart start racing and just my body tense up, and I just kind of started crying, and these nurses thought I was crying because I was in pain or had a contraction. And I'm like, no, I'm just so frustrated right now that like
Mm.
this is not what's supposed to be happening. Um, and I get checked and I'm only like I was barely a 2, I think, but my contractions were very consistent.
Mm.
They were all on my back. And so I think just all of that leading up to me being in the hospital, I was there for about 20 plus hours, 24 hours, I think. I thankfully, I tried to refuse so many things. I kept, do you want an epidural? Do you want Pitocin? I gave them my little sheet that I'd printed off of all my preferences, like, please just go by this. Like, I don't need to keep telling you these
Yes,
things.
yes.
And
And of course,
we
during
went in
this
there,
time, you couldn't have a doula or anyone that could advocate for you either, even if you
right.
wanted that during
Yes,
the
and that was
period.
actually a part of our original plan was that we were going to have a doula.
Mm,
And then when they weren't allowed and we were going to only have to do virtual, I was like, well, I don't want a virtual doula. So then I told my husband, I'm like, okay, so if we're not going to have a doula, then you better buck up and learn a
mm.
lot more about things than you were originally planning on, because
But
I'm
it's
going to need
still so
more
hard,
support.
like both for him, whoever your partner is, to have that responsibility. Also, like this is his first baby, he knows nothing about hospital policies and the
Right.
hierarchy and the ways. And even if you know everything, it's still so hard to walk into
Yeah.
the lion's den and advocate for yourself. Like if you're gonna have a hospital birth, I say to everyone, have a secret birth worker, have a doula, have someone with you
Yes.
that can help you hold the space for you and not and
Yes.
try to mitigate less intervention, less talking, less
Right.
disturbance. Mm.
Yes. And part of the first interactions I had were I was there in the middle of the night on a Saturday, or I think it was a Saturday, Friday or Saturday. So it was like, it was a weekend. And one of the first nurses, her English was not her first language, was like, she's trying to tell me things that I knew that I didn't want, but it was hard to communicate and literally like advocate for myself, like, and understand exactly what she was trying to tell me. Um, like the little needle they put in your hand just in case you get an epidural. And I was like, no, I don't want that right now. I literally just got here. Like,
Yeah.
please don't put that on my hand. I do not want it. So it's just like lots of no, thank you, please. So just lots and lots of trying to tell them like, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. And it wasn't until they had a shift change and it was during the day, and I had a nurse that was so supportive of me. Anytime the OB came in and was like, oh, we can break your water. Oh, we can give you Pitocin. The nurse said, this is your show. You're running the show. You do not
Mm.
have to have them break your water. You do not have to do this. You are in
Mm.
control.
Mm.
And I'm so thankful for her, because there was a time where I think I had agreed to a Pitocin later on because, I was stuck at I don't even know, it was like a 5 or something for like 5 hours, laying on my side for hours. Um, and I looked at her, I said, I just need you to tell me that my window for an epidural is closing, because I know I don't want one, but I don't know how much longer I can do this.
Mm.
Um, and she just gently and calmly explained to me, like, I know you're having a really hard time being still. I know you don't want one. You're doing so well. You're almost there. And I said, okay, like I'm not going to get one. I don't want one. And I was just so thankful for her, because she knew what I wanted. And she was really just like, just this calm, gentle spirit in my ear, like really just supporting me and guiding me to
Yeah.
like what I actually wanted, instead of listening to what the OBs were trying to tell me what to do.
Beautiful. Did you feel like looking back, being, as you call it, stuck at 5 centimeters for 5 hours? What was going through your mind, your body, your heart at that time? Did you feel safe? Did you feel supported? Did you really, do you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
we're so influenced by our environment. The whole thing about, like, for example, not progressing is
Mhm.
usually a lot is because we're not feeling that deep trust and daring to surrender to the power coming through and feeling the trust in the people and the surroundings to do so.
I think that hit a huge part of it, especially when I compare it to my second birth, because um, I think I knew, like, deep down, I really did not want to be in the hospital for my birth. And so I
Yeah.
think as much as I was trying to let go of that, I think it was still really a huge part of why my labor took so long, and why, I wasn't really progressing. And, they were, trying to get me to change positions, and I was trying to follow their lead, but I actually had just I can't even remember a time until the very, very end when I was getting closer to push when I had a contraction in the front. So everything I felt was in my back and in my
Mm,
spine. And it was so intense and seriously painful. Um,
mm,
that's where I was like, I don't know how much longer I can do this because every contraction I just had to muscle through and I squeezed my husband's hand as
mm.
hard as I possibly could. Um, and yeah, I did not want to be there. I did not want to be in the hospital. I did not like
Yeah,
who, like at the beginning when I first got there, I did not like who was talking to me. I didn't trust them. I remember when the first OB came in, I just looked at her face and I was like, gosh, she barely looks older than I am, and I was like 31 or something at the time. And I'm like, it's just like all these little things that pop in your head. You're just like, I don't trust this person. I don't trust this person. Like that's what was
yeah,
going off when I got checked in triage, when the first nurse, checked on me in the room, when the first OB came in, it was just like all these things of like trust and just
yeah.
not
It's
feeling
so
safe.
important. And this is the key, like, takeaway from obviously from this birth that you took is like it's so important to progress in labor. So it sounds like, when you said you were squeezing your, partner's hand and you weren't feeling safe, that probably a part of you were resisting the process of opening because you didn't have that full feeling of trust and surrender in that place that you were in. And it's so key information because a lot of people go like, well, with our first, let's just have a hospital birth for our first
Mhm.
because, we want to keep ourselves safe. But actually, you really have to tune in as a woman. And, of course, it's so important what your partner feels and thinks too, because that's going to affect you in labor. So it's
Right.
good to really be, on the same page. But ultimately, you're the one that's going to birth a baby. And the process will go smoother if you feel like you are in the right place where you want to birth. So, to summarize this birth, how did it end?
Um, well, I ended up with an OB who trained my OB at the office. So that gave me that little sense of comfort. It was like, okay, she knows my OB from the doctor's office. Like that gave me a little bit of peace. And I I probably pushed for about, my husband said like maybe 40 minutes or so. Um, the OB did ask if I wanted a episiotomy, and I was shocked when she asked me that, and I was like, what? No, like I've barely been pushing. Like she's like, well, you're really tight, and I'm like, no, I do not want one. So I was very surprised that she offered that. I was coached to push, another thing that I learned from a pelvic floor PT birth class. It's like, don't hold your breath, don't. And so it's like I'm coached and doing these things and being offered these things that I knew I did not want in the back of my head. But ultimately, he came out and he was fine and healthy and everything was good. So yeah, so it was a lot, a lot of like back and forth and resistance and just like, oh my gosh, like what is going on? And then I also felt something that I was really surprised at when he came out. I think as his head came out, I felt her pull him out the rest of the way.
Yeah.
And I was not expecting that. Like I was like thinking, okay, I'm gonna feel his head come out and I'll push him out.
Mm.
Um, but as his head come out, I actually felt her like bring him out. And I was like, that's another thing that caught me off guard in the middle of
Yeah,
him,
that's quite
coming out.
common that doctors will do that. They think that they're helping by birthing the shoulders. Um, but the better, you leave well alone is much better, both for your pelvic floor, for your perineum, and for the baby to take its time.
Yeah.
Some babies want to stay for another contraction before they birth their shoulders and the body. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I did tear a little bit, like a second degree tear,
Yeah.
um, and I mean overall it was fine. The recovery was fine.
Yeah. So let's dive on into like, then becoming pregnant again and like knowing that this was not the experience you wanted for your second. Did you know that
Yeah,
like straight away? Did you go like not doing this again?
yes, absolutely. I reached out to the same midwife I had with I first. It just emailed, asked her about her availability and things. And I also searched out for other people in different areas. my husband knew that I really just did not want a hospital birth, and he wasn't super excited about a home birth, but I was like, listen, I'm not having a hospital birth, and I need to have midwives this time. So I just kind of Googled and searched, and there's an area about an hour or so from us who I just happened to find, it was midwives, not hospital affiliated. And, I read her page and just like everything, she talked about, the physiological birth and like, letting women kind of lead and take their time, just like all the things that you hear about, like that kind of should happen with midwife-led births, not in a hospital.
Mm.
Um, and I just had a Zoom like kind of meet and greet with them, and there were other people, other potential, patients, clients on the call. And I had a bunch of questions, they suggested coming with, a list of questions and different things. And I just had a really good feeling about them. And even though they were an hour and like 10 minutes away, they had their own birth house, just down the road from their office. And the other kind of drawing point for my husband was, if we were to have to go to the hospital, it was like a 2-minute ride away. So even though we were driving, an hour and 10 minutes to, prenatal appointments and the birth center, it was kind of like a good trade-off because I felt really comfortable and just had a good feeling about the midwives. And I knew, I'm like, okay, there's other people that drive over an hour to, to their birthing place. Like, let's just make this work. And so that's kind of just what we decided on and went with.
Yeah, beautiful. So let's dive on into your birth story. Did you have any early signs of labor approaching for you at all?
Uh, Not really. So I had my first, I went into labor on his due date right at like 40 weeks. And then I had him the next day, like 24 hours later. So I was kind of expecting to go like 40 plus weeks-ish with my second. Um, and I think that weekend it was like 38 weeks and like, 5 or 6 days. Um, we had a friend's birthday party, nothing. I just fully was not expecting to like go into labor really anytime soon. But then looking back, I did like ride the lawnmower that Saturday, and like, I'm just like, well, maybe did that like kickstart anything? Like, I don't know. Um, so it was a Tuesday morning, and I woke up and I didn't necessarily feel any different, but I did have a slight bloody show. Um, I did not tell my husband because I didn't want him, he was working from home that day and he had different meetings and such. And I just didn't want him to think like, okay, we have to go up now because we have an hour plus drive. Like, I had a friend who lives close by, so we were going to stay at her house, if we needed to. And I was like, no, we don't need to go yet. It's going to be fine. Um, but I dropped my toddler off at daycare. And as I was walking out, I just like felt this heaviness. I'm like,
Mm.
today might be the day. Like today might happen. So I get home and I still didn't say anything to my husband. I just kind of let him work, and I was downstairs just kind of cleaning up and doing things. Um, but then I got a call from the midwife's office. So I'm like basically 39 weeks in one day at this point. And it was from one of the office assistants telling me that my blood work from 38 weeks came in and my iron was very, very low. My
Hmm.
hemoglobin and my ferritin, um, to the point where, they wanted to prepare me for a potential hospital transfer if I were to lose a lot of blood after delivery. And I just started crying because, that's like the last thing that I wanted. And my iron was low throughout my entire pregnancy. So I feel like there was some miscommunication as to like, I was taking extra supplements, like what else could I have been doing? Like, what else can I do to like get this iron to absorb in my body? And the assistant had mentioned chlorophyll and nettle leaf tea.
Yes, nettle. Yes, good. And
Um,
lamb is very good. Kangaroo, if you're in Australia, is very good.
yeah, I don't know. I was I was doubling my iron intake and it just wasn't enough. And
It's really also, it's not easy for the body to absorb from a tablet, right? And I don't know what kind of prenatals you had, but most are just unfortunately expensive pee. Like they're not bioavailable. And
mhm,
so it's really important to source really good prenatal vitamins, including iron, that actually is combined in a way that a body can absorb it.
yeah, I was taking additional iron supplements as well as my prenatal. I was taking it's Mega Food brand was the brand of the prenatal for like a whole food based prenatal, and then I think the brand was called Hemoplex for the iron. Um, but yeah, it just was not enough apparently. And
Mhm.
so the assistant had said, like you can try, these two supplements and, to increase your iron, but, the midwives do want you to get another blood draw this week to see what your levels are at. Just so they can see, because it was like a week away, it was a week apart, and I was 39 weeks at that point. So that we can do a virtual, prenatal telehealth meeting tomorrow, and we'll get that set up for you, and we'll order your labs for the next day. And I said, okay. So my thought was that, okay, I'm going to go to the store, I'm going to get this chlorophyll and this nettle leaf tea, and I'm going to double my iron, and I'm going to get my iron levels up in a day's time and go get my blood drawn and prove that like everything's fine. I don't need to go to the hospital after, delivery and all this stuff. So I go upstairs and I'm like visibly in tears and upset. And I go to my husband, I said, I'm going to run to the store. I need to get these supplements. He's like, are you okay? And I'm like, yes, it's fine. But like, he's like, do you need me to come with you? And I'm like, no, it's fine. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have driven to the store because it was like a 20+ minute drive to go there and get the supplements and come back. But I did that, and I didn't really feel any consistent contractions. I think for the days leading up to this day, I'd feel what I assumed were Braxton Hicks like when I'd move, or I would just feel like little twinges, but it was nothing like intense or something I could pinpoint. It was kind of like, oh, okay, like I can feel, this happening when I move in a certain way. Um, so I kind of just tried to carry on about my day and just like relax a little bit more. I laid on the couch and just watched some TV, and it was probably around 4 o'clock or so, maybe 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon, where I felt like what I was like, okay, that might have been an actual contraction. It was, started my back and actually wrapped around to the front a little bit. So at that point, I finally did tell my husband, I'm like, okay, so I think today might be the day. And he was like, yeah, I could kind of tell like something was going on. Um, so I was like, okay, well, like, let's just like see how things go. We'll pick up our son from daycare. We'll drop him off at your parents. But in my head, all this time, I still thought like, okay, my labor is going to slow down. I'm going to go get blood work tomorrow. Everything's going to be fine. But I was having contractions on the drive to get our son at his parents' house. And we're talking and I'm like getting antsy. I'm like, okay, like I want to go home. Like I need to go back home. Like I'm having contractions like sporadically, but they're there and like we need to go home.
And this
So
time, were they in your back or were they in the front?
they were in the back, but they were still slightly getting towards the front. And with my first, like I do not remember having contractions at the front at all until I was about ready to push. So feeling something towards the front, I was like, okay, like this is different. Um, and back labor was something that like definitely scared me again because of how long I had it with my first. Um, but it wasn't as intense, to the point where I like thought something was wrong, or it was too uncomfortable to bear. So we get home and I was like, okay, well, let's make dinner. And the contractions are getting closer together, but not super duper intense. And I'm just practicing my breathing at this point. And I'm telling my husband, I'm like, if I seem like things are intense, they're not yet. I'm just like really practicing my breathing. Like I just really want to like get this down. He was like, okay, well, you sound like they're kind of intense. I'm like, no, like I'm just practicing my breathing. I just want to, count down and count up and just keep doing that. Um, so I did call the midwife and let her know that I thought I was in early labor. And she just reminded me, she kind of was, did the office call you about your blood work? And I said yes. And she said, okay, well, it's very, very low. I just want you to be prepared for hospital transfer in case something happens, post-delivery. She's like, we can also do a shot of Pitocin to help the blood loss if you're okay with that. And I just agreed right there because the hospital, transfer was the last thing that I wanted. And at that point, I did just kind of let go and just say, okay, if something's going to happen, and a hospital transfer is what needs to happen after, then like, so be it, but right now I trust my body and everything's going to be fine. So I agreed to the Pitocin on the phone, knowing that that could help, not have a hospital transfer. And she said, okay, just, call back when things get more intense and closer together. So I barely eat dinner. I tried to eat some dinner that we made, but I was just like, I just don't want to. I just don't feel like eating. And it was probably less than an hour when I called her. I said, things are getting a little bit more intense and I'm timing them and they're probably, definitely within 5 minutes, but I just would feel more comfortable if we just drove up. Since we have over an hour drive. And she said, okay, we'll see when you get here, how things are going. And, if you're not too far along, we'll just, leave you alone and see how things go. So we got in the car and I got in the back seat and I tried to distract myself as much as I could on the drive up. I was checking in with people. I was letting people know. I was kind of like just looking out the window in between contractions, even though they were building and getting more intense. And something I want to mention that I feel like helped me when I was in the car, it's really easy to tense up through everything, but I just opened my palms through every contraction and just kept reminding myself to like release, 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 stay open. And that just really helped me relax through them a little bit more and just to not let my body tense up as much. So yeah, I think and then just kind of distracting myself a little bit, like looking out the window, texting people, letting people know that like, we're heading up to the birth house. Things are definitely happening. And it probably within like 10 minutes left of the drive, I was kind of like, okay, please make it, please make it. I wasn't, that close, I don't think. At the time, I really just didn't know what was going to happen, but just knowing that we were hitting stoplights, and seeing, different stop signs, I'm like, oh my gosh, like just a little bit further, just a little bit further, and seeing the ETA on the GPS. Okay, we got 3 minutes, 2 minutes. Okay, we're gonna make it. So we get it to the parking lot and we're greeted by the birth assistant, and I had one more contraction where I was still timing them, and I just hit my timer, ended it, and got out. And I knew that when we got to the birth house, I had to make it up the stairs. If I was really close, there was a room on the first level that I could have gone to, but I knew I could make it up the stairs to the main birth suite, the main bedroom there. And I had one more contraction on the bed, and then the midwife asked to check me, which we talked about beforehand. Like, I knew that was going to happen. That's something that like we agreed upon, or I agreed to, and knew that I wanted to be checked. We also had a conversation about, sharing where you're at in dilation and her feelings and like what I wanted. And we were both on the same page. Like I did not want to know where my dilation was at, because I just felt like when even in my first, I asked to not have them tell me because I just knew it didn't really matter a ton. So with the midwife, she just calmly checked and said, okay, if you want, I can break your bag of water and we can speed things up. And I just acknowledged, that offer, but I knew that's not what I wanted. And it wasn't like like, oh, we should do this. It's kind of like, hey, if you want things to move faster, we can do this. Um, but, obviously totally up to you. And I just acknowledged the offer and I said, okay, can I get in the tub? And she said, yep. Maybe about 45 minutes or so. Let's see. And so I got in the tub, and that was like the one thing that I really wanted. I was like, okay, like I want to labor in the tub. I love the water. I love the bath. But it was not as great as I wanted it to be. I think just because I had so much pressure in my back, just a lot. I mean, I still had things wrapping around to the front, but there was just still a lot of back labor. And so being on a hard, porcelain surface was not the most comfortable. I accidentally, we had the water running, but the tub wasn't filling up because I like accidentally like unplugged the drain. So it's just like, like the tub isn't running like as fast as I wanted to and filling up as fast. Um, and the whole time I'm also asking my husband to give me like the hip squeezes. So it's just like a little awkward to like, hip squeezes in the tub. You're on your hands and knees, like leaned over, but like you're barely even in the water. And so I was also offered wooden combs
Mm.
to have in my hands during the contractions, but that was another thing that like I tried them and I was like, well, I just feel like I'm tensing up too much with them.
Mm.
So it was another thing that I was just like, I don't feel like the combs are going to help me or distract me from, anything
Yeah.
really. So I just kind of set those down. And my husband was watching the time. He's like, okay, well, it's been about like 45 minutes, let's get out and try something else. And so get out and I get on the bed and they suggested a couple like side lying where I bring my knee like really far up and go through those. And
The
again, my
side
husband's,
lying release, if anyone's curious, that's spinning babies. Mm.
yeah. And those felt fine, but like I didn't really feel like they were doing anything. The whole time my husband was hip squeezing, like every time I would just was like, like hip squeeze, like tapping him. Um, And then the midwife suggested I try a few contractions on the toilet, which I did not want to do at all because anytime I got on the toilet with my first, it was so painful and I did not want to, but I was like, okay, like I trust them, like I will try a couple on the toilet. And it was my second and then my water broke. So, and I kind of laughed because I even said to her, I was like, oh, that's why you wanted me to get on the toilet because you knew my water was about to break. And she's like, yep. And so there was like, it was nice to have like that little bit of like that like calm, like laughing nature in between contractions, even though things were like really intense. It was kind of like, these people are here for me. I feel supported. They know what they're doing. I trust them, entirely. So at that
Oh,
point,
good.
we were at the birth center for probably about, I'm gonna say like maybe 55 or 60 minutes by the time my water broke. And then things got really intense and I got on the bed and they gave me the peanut ball. So I was laying on the bed on all fours on that. And I definitely started getting very vocal. I am as many of your podcast episodes as I listened to and thought, okay, like I can be quiet, not everybody needs to like, growl and groan through them. And I could not. It was just too intense. And I remember looking up and seeing the second midwife there. And at that point, I didn't know if she was there or not. But seeing her, I just felt this like wave of comfort wash over me because she was somebody who I'd actually seen for most of the prenatal appointments. So
Mm.
knowing that she was there also just gave me this like, okay, like she's here, like everyone's here, like I just kept reminding myself and like I could hear those little voices like, you're safe, you're supported, you can do this. And so she was there and she was, giving me a washcloth and the birth assistant was amazing as well. And the other midwife was just kind of standing behind and back, just watching. And um, she kind of offered a suggestion, like a lot of your groaning is coming through your throat, like see if you can get it down in your belly.
Mm.
Um, and I took that suggestion and she's like, there you go. That's what's going to really, that's what's going to open you up and get those contractions working better for you. Um, And I don't know how long I was on all fours or if I was even pushing at that point, because I just know it was like so much pressure and so intense that it's like it was also just so different than my first, where I was on my back, I was being coached to push with my first. And this, they were just very quiet and just kind of let me do my thing, offered suggestions that, were going to help me get me further along, but nothing that was going to be, something that something that I was, uncomfortable with. Like anything they said was very just gentle and calm. And I knew they were just trying to offer suggestions that were going to put me in the best position, mentally and physically. And it wasn't, well, so I think I must have been like either close to pushing, um, because one of the midwives came behind and it was funny because I felt her gloved hand on my leg, and then I felt my husband's other hand on my leg. And I felt her like wiping my bum, and I'm like, okay, like I'm clearly pooping right now because I just feel like something is changing, like things are happening. And it was definitely close to that point too, where I was like, okay, how much longer am I going to be doing this? Like, and it's like always in those moments you look back, like if you've
Mm.
given birth, you're close, it's like, because you have that like very tiny small moment of like, okay, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And then you turn a corner and you're like, the baby's coming.
Yeah.
Um, so they they suggested I flip onto my back. And I was kind of like, huh, okay, like I wasn't expecting it, but it was just like a fleeting, like, um, just thought of like, well, that's interesting. Um, but I think just because I fully just trusted, what they were doing, and knowing that they were just, you know, there to make suggestions that were going to actually be helpful. And whereas like, an OB wants you to get on your back and you're like, why? But with them, I was like, okay, well, I've been on all fours for probably about 20 plus minutes. Like, we're gonna just try something else. And as soon as I flipped over and I had that contraction, um, the baby definitely was like ready to come out. I felt her head, and the pain there I was not expecting, because with my first, they talk about like the ring of fire, and that crowning, and I had that with him, but it wasn't so intense. Maybe because I don't know, because I was pushing longer, or what the reason was. But with her, as soon as I flipped over and I had that contraction where she was coming, like it was so intense. And the midwife, was like, okay, slow down, slow down. And I was like, I can't. It was like almost like this, like quiet scream of like, I can't stop. Um, and they, just encouraged me, like, okay, just slow down, like one more breath. And, they said, okay, her head's out. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I think another contraction and her body was out, and they handed her to me and put her on my chest. And it was just kind of like, wow, like I can't believe that happened. Um, because it was just so different from my first. And um, I was just so thankful for them and just how it all played out. And just the fact that I went from a 20-hour plus labor in the hospital to like 3 hours of active labor. It was an hour plus drive to the hospital, and it was in the car when I like got my timer, and they was like, okay, you're in active labor based on what my contractions were in an app I was using. And, in an hour, plus at the birth center. So, um, yeah, she was born like 3 hours after we got in the car. Um, and they gave me the Pitocin after, because, we wanted to make sure I wasn't going to lose too much blood. And even with that, they said I did great and it was fine, and I did not need to be transferred, which they were both very thankful for as well. Um, and yeah, and then I just confirmed with them that like, yes, it was a girl, because we didn't find out till much later on. in the pregnancy what we were having. And so I was like, it is a girl, right? Like, just want to confirm. And they laughed and said yes. And yeah, I was just so surprised that it happened like the way it did, and just
Mhm.
thankful.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. And I can really see that because you got so emotional and like touched by that moment. So, so grateful that you had that experience and that you felt such trust and faith in your midwives. When you got the syntocin or the pitocin, you say in the US,
Yeah.
was that straight after birth or was that after when they saw that you were bleeding some, or was that to birth the
Um,
placenta? Did you do like the active third stage where they help you kind of with gently tugging on the cord and releasing the placenta?
yes, um, they did help get the placenta out. There wasn't any issue with it. They just gently kind of helped guide it out. It wasn't something that
Mm,
I like, I it wasn't like stuck in there. It wasn't something that I don't know if I was able to like fully get out on my own, or they just kind of helped gently bring it out with the contractions afterwards. I don't know if I had the Pitocin immediately after, or if it was after the birth of the placenta. Everything was pretty quickly after she came out. I wasn't, um, it wasn't like, 30 plus minutes or anything going by. It was like, she
yeah,
came out,
yeah.
the placenta came out soon after. Um, and I imagine I got the Pitocin shortly after the placenta came out.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because there's two different ways of birthing the placenta. It's the physiological one that just kind of waits for the placenta to come out and comes out, by itself. And then there's the active one where, and there's actually like somewhere in between two in some places around the world where it's like a modified third stage where they don't pull on the placenta, but they give the oxytocin. And so there's different ways, but usually there's two kind of main ways, and then some places around the world have this modified one in between. And the reason I ask is just, I understand giving the synthetic oxytocin if they can start to see like, oh yeah, you are actually bleeding. Let's give that now to make you stop, so you don't have to transfer. And I was
Right.
wondering if that was what they did, like seeing that you actually did bleed, or if it was just kind of prophylactic, which is that kind of you do it before because you think that that's going to prevent that. And the reason I ask is just, not to take any way, away from your beautiful story, but for anyone listening,
For
um,
sure.
that actual research shows that if you had a physiological natural birth, then it's actually a lower risk for you to bleed postpartum,
Mm,
so after birth, not giving the synthetic oxytocin, that actually the synthetic oxytocin given prophylactically, so in the active third stage doing that, or just prophylactically because you don't want the woman to bleed, actually increases the risk.
mm,
But not a lot of people know this. And so that's why
right.
I'm saying it for anyone who's listening that might have the similar story of like, oh, you're anemic or you have this and that.
Hmm.
Let's do this prophylactically. I would advise them to talk to their midwives or OB and go like, hey, actually, I have heard this about evidence and that it's actually going to increase my risk of bleeding if I have a natural physiological birth. It's different if you've had like a medicalized birth. It's different if you've
Hmm.
had synthetic oxytocin within, your labor process. But if you haven't, it actually increases the risk of bleeding.
Yeah, I wish I knew, and I wish I remembered. But I don't recall.
That's okay. I just wanted to give that piece of information. It doesn't actually matter how
Yeah.
and when they gave it. I was just curious, just,
Hmm.
wanting to give that information to anyone listening as well, because that's kind of what people generally thinks is that, oh, let's just do this prophylactically to prevent you, which makes sense in the hospital setting because it's usually so meddled with that,
Hmm.
it is intervened with. And so then that would be better. But when it's a totally physiological natural birth, it's actually safer and reduces your risk of bleeding. Even if you maybe had like low iron and then were potentially at risk of bleeding.
Hmm.
But so it's better to wait and see. So it's better if someone's listening who's anemic, they're going to have a home birth, birth center birth, or hospital birth, that actually just waiting and seeing if you actually have a big bleed, or not big bleed, but if you start bleeding more than
Mhm.
they, consider is looking normal, then you can give the syntocin on, or pitocin in the US then.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if you had a first time mama in front of you right now who's about to have her first baby and she really wants to have a natural and empowering birth experience, what advice and pearls of wisdoms would you give to her?
I mean, first and foremost, you definitely should educate yourself on some level, because nobody's really going to do it for you. And so you really do have to prepare yourself um, mentally, more than anything. But I think especially with the second time around, knowing that I was going to be with midwives, knowing I was not going to be in the hospital, um, just hearing as many birth stories as I could that were in a non-hospital, setting. So listening to your podcast was something that honestly did help me so much. And just, I looked forward to, combing through the different stories and seeing, which ones I felt like, even if they weren't going to be anywhere near where I was giving birth, of, you had so many different stories on there. Just hearing what somebody can go through and all the different ways people can experience labor was just really helpful. And it helped me come up with questions for my midwives and, saying like, oh, hey, I heard this one story of where this happened. So what would you do in this scenario? Um, because those firsthand accounts are just proof that, you really can do this. You're capable. Your body is meant to do this. Um, and just releasing any doubt as much as possible, and releasing your fears and writing them all down, and just realizing that those do have a really big effect on your labor, and that safety and feeling supported is just very huge. So not underestimating your birth team and
Yeah.
that support, because it was just so evident and even my husband would say this, it was like, you clearly did not feel comfortable in the hospital, and
Mm.
you clearly felt supported and safe, with this team, and look at the difference between your labor and deliveries. So it definitely turned him from a skeptical, um, midwife, supporter, to yeah, these people know what they're doing and they're there to actually like support you from the early stages, and even every week after for, 6+ weeks and on. He
Mm.
was very impressed with the care. So that was nice to see that difference as well.
That is like all men witnessing births into births, home births, are
Yeah.
like turned into the biggest advocates for
Hmm.
midwives, for home birth, for natural birth, for birth center birth.
Yeah,
And it's like night and day, like
it really is.
literally. So often
Yeah.
they can be so scared, so skeptical, not really on board. And then they just
Hmm.
go total flip. And they're almost more like enthusiastic than the woman and like
Hmm.
us, right? They're like,
Yeah.
oh my God, to all their buddies, go like, yo, wives should home birth. Your wives should birth in a birth center.
Yeah, I mean, he was like, hey, I mean, yeah, nobody in our area really, especially our friends, and close family. I mean, I have nurses in the family, and they're like, trying to not say too much to me, knowing that they have a very different set of opinions. And I'm like, this is what I want to do, and this is what I feel comfortable with.
Mhm.
Um, and, our friends are like, so where did you give birth again? And I was like, well, technically it was a house, by the midwife team. And we were home within 6 hours. And they're like, so you didn't have to stay in the birth's house for 24 hours? I'm like, no, we were in our beds resting, 6+ hours after, less than 6 hours really, after giving birth, because that's what we felt comfortable doing, and we were fine to head home. So everyone was just very confused and like, huh, like that's interesting.
Yeah, because everyone's so indoctrinated to thinking that it's like dangerous and that you need to be checked and someone need to make sure that you're going to be able to, take care of your baby and,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
just a normal life event.
Yeah. And I obviously some people feel more comfortable birthing in a hospital, whether it's with midwives or with OBs, and I feel happy for them. I'm glad that is their situation. What really makes me sad is when people go into, a hospital, whether it's midwives or OBs, and they feel taken advantage of, or they feel like their birth did not go the way that they wanted it to for X, Y, and Z reasons, or they were encouraged to, be induced for whatever reason, and then they ended up with a C-section. And it's like all these statistics are right there. And it's like you just don't want to believe them because you really want to believe, well, I really like my OB, and I really feel like, they're there for me. And it's like, yes, they probably are there for you, but they're also guided by hospital policies that they have to follow um, to save their own asses. And yes, of course, they care for you and you're under their care. But when it comes down to it, like if you didn't have the birth that you imagined, um, and you felt traumatized for whatever reason, it just makes me so sad that that's kind of the system that is set up for us.
Yeah.
um, and I wish that even my husband was like, why aren't there more midwives around? Why aren't there more, people that can get this care? Like, why isn't it available? And I'm like, I don't know. um,
Follow the
and
money.
yeah, right. Well,
Follow the
yeah.
money.
So, yeah, it's just I just recently know somebody who had that situation happen to them where it's like she was so scared, and she even had a doula, and things did not work out. And I'm like, it just makes me so sad for
Yeah.
those situations.
Yeah. Mm. That's that's how the world is today, unfortunately. You need like a really kick-ass birth advocate. And I think doulas are amazing, but today, and that's why I created the Sacred Birthworker Mentorship. Today, doulas generally, like they do a course over a weekend or a week, and they can be lovely at supporting you emotionally, but a lot of them don't have the knowledge and the skills to actually be the birth advocate, especially in the hospital, that you actually need. So I would
Mhm.
say definitely have one, but source the right one, someone who really knows their shit.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ashley. I loved your birth story. Love that you had this beautiful, quick, amazing birth that
So
filled
unexpected.
you. Yeah, and that filled you with so much joy and gratitude. And yeah, beautiful to hear your story. Thank you for listening. If you love this podcast, then please consider sharing it, leave a review, or make a contribution on our Patreon page. And if you want to connect on social media, then find the podcast on Instagram as the Natural Birth Podcast. Thank you for listening.